The bodies were ash, not charred, not burned. Ash so fine it blew away in the wind. Father Peter Pernin stood in what used to be Peshtigo, Wisconsin, on the morning of October 9th, 1871. The ground was still hot. The temperature the night before had reached 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Trees hadn't burned, they'd exploded. Buildings hadn't caught fire, they'd vaporized. Between 1,500 and 2,500 people were dead, most of them reduced to powder. 260 miles south, Chicago was burning at the exact same moment. Everyone's heard of the Chicago fire. Mrs. O'Leary's cow, the lantern. 300 dead. National tragedy. But Peshtigo killed 5 to 8 times as many people, and almost nobody knows it happened. I didn't set out to question the official story of October 8th, 1871. I believed what I was taught. Drought, wind, logging debris. Terrible coincidence. But then I started mapping the architecture. The cities that burned that night, Chicago, Peshtigo, Holland, Manistee, Port Huron, they all had something in common. Grand civic buildings, ornate courthouses with copper domes, elaborate hotels, structures built with precision that shouldn't have been possible for frontier lumber towns. And on October 8th, 1871, within hours of each other, they all burned. Not gradually, not spreading from one city to the next, simultaneously, across 3 states, hundreds of miles apart. The official explanation is drought and wind, natural disaster, bad timing. But I found something in the eyewitness accounts, something that doesn't sound like any forest fire in history. Buildings bursting into flame with no apparent ignition source. Fires falling from the sky. Blue flames burning in basements where wood doesn't burn blue. A roaring sound witnesses compared to freight trains and tornadoes combined. And temperatures that melted iron and turned stone to powder. So let me walk you through what I found about October 8th, 1871. The documented facts about what burned, the architecture that was destroyed, the evidence that was lost. And then we need to talk about what Peshtigo really was and why its destruction had to be forgotten. I started with the buildings. Peshtigo in 1871 wasn't just a lumber town. The population was 1,700, but the infrastructure didn't match. City records describe an opera house, multiple hotels with elaborate facades, a courthouse, commercial buildings with cast iron columns and ornate stonework. But for a town that had only been incorporated in 1859, 12 years before the fire, this level of construction seemed impossible. Building an opera house in the wilderness when most residents lived in simple wooden homes? But the records are clear. These buildings existed. Holland, Michigan had similar anomalies. The Third Reformed Church, described in pre-fire accounts as having architectural elements that confused local historians. Stone foundations that seemed far older than the 1847 settlement date. A city hall with copper domework that matched patterns I'd seen in supposedly much older European structures. Manistee had multiple steam mills with engineering that contemporary sources called advanced beyond expectation. The McGill and Canfield Mill on Blackbird Island was described as having metal framework and precision that exceeded typical frontier construction. Chicago, everyone knows about Chicago's grand buildings, but what's interesting is the timing. The city had exploded in size in the 1850s and 1860s. Somehow, in just 20 years, it had transformed from a frontier outpost to a city of grand hotels, massive civic structures, and infrastructure that rivaled European capitals, Port Huron, White Rock, Marinette. Every town that burned on October 8th, 1871 had these same architectural anomalies, buildings that seemed too sophisticated, too precise, too advanced for their supposed construction dates. And on one night, across 3 states, they all turned to ash. The fire at Peshtigo began around 9:30 p.m. on October 8th. This is documented fact. Multiple survivors, including Father Pernin, reported the exact timing. But here's what the eyewitness accounts actually describe. The fire didn't spread into town, it appeared. Witnesses reported a roaring sound approaching from the southwest. Then the sky turned red, then orange, then white. And then buildings were exploding. Not catching fire, exploding. Father Pernin wrote that the heat was like standing inside a furnace. People who tried to shelter in their homes found the walls bursting into flame from the inside. Wells that should have been safe refuges boiled. The Peshtigo River, where hundreds fled for safety, was so hot that survivors described their skin blistering in the water. The fire moved at approximately 100 miles per hour. For context, normal forest fires advance at speeds a person can outrun. Maybe 10 miles per hour at most. This was moving 20 times faster. The temperature reached an estimated 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Wood ignites at around 500 degrees. At 2,000 degrees, you're approaching the melting point of some metals. Cast iron melts at 2,200 degrees. Survivors found iron hinges melted into puddles. Nails had liquefied. Stone foundations had turned to powder. This is documented. These aren't speculation. These are reported facts from witnesses and physical evidence examined after the fire. But here's what bothers me most about the Peshtigo accounts. Multiple witnesses reported blue flames, specifically in basements and lower floors of buildings. Father Pernin mentioned it. Multiple other survivors mentioned it. The newspaper accounts from October 1871 reference it. Wood doesn't burn blue. Wood burns orange, red, yellow. Blue flames indicate burning gas. Methane burns blue. Acetylene burns blue. Natural gas burns blue. Why were there blue flames in wooden buildings in 1871 Wisconsin? The official explanation is that carbon monoxide, produced by incomplete combustion in oxygen-starved basements, can burn with a blue tinge. This is technically possible. But carbon monoxide flames are faint, ghostly blue. Witnesses described intense, bright blue flames, the kind you see when pure gas is burning. And this wasn't just in Peshtigo. In Chicago, fire officials reported the exact same thing. Multiple accounts from the Great Chicago Fire mentioned blue flames in basements. One fire marshal, convinced he'd extinguished a blaze, returned to find an eruption of blue flame in a completely different location. In Manistee, witnesses described the beach sawdust burning with colors not typical of wood fire. The same phenomenon, reported across 3 states on the same night. While I was examining the fire reports, I noticed something else in the 1870 census records. Peshtigo's population in 1870 was listed as 1,749, but the town had infrastructure for a much larger population. The boarding houses, the hotels, the commercial district, the opera house. Census records also show something strange about Peshtigo's growth. In 1860, the population was around 800. In 1870, it was 1,749, more than double in 10 years. But the building inventory doesn't match that timeline. Now, contemporary accounts describe structures that looked well established in the 1860s. Stone foundations, elaborate architectural details, the kind of weathering and patina that suggests decades, not years. It's almost as if the buildings preceded the official population, as if Peshtigo had been built for a different purpose or by different people and was being repopulated in the 1850s and 1860s. Holland, Michigan shows the same pattern, founded officially in 1847 by Dutch settlers, but archaeological surveys in the 1950s found stone foundations beneath the town that Dutch historians couldn't explain. Foundations using construction techniques that didn't match Dutch building practices of the 1840s. The 1950s, surveyors noted these anomalies, but had no explanation. The findings were filed away. The official history remained unchanged. Manistee's first sawmill was supposedly built in 1841, but early photographs from the 1850s show the mill complex with stonework and metal framing that looks far more weathered than 10-year-old construction. I'm not saying these towns weren't settled in the 1840s and 1850s. The census records are clear. People moved there. Families established homesteads. But what if they were moving into existing infrastructure? What if these weren't new towns, but reoccupied ones? What if the 1871 fires destroyed evidence of whoever built there first? October 8th, 1871 wasn't just Peshtigo and Chicago. The scope of what burned that night is almost never discussed. At 2 p.m. that afternoon, church bells in Holland, Michigan began ringing fire alarms. Small fires that had been burning south of town suddenly intensified. By midnight, hurricane-force winds were driving flames through the city. By morning, 2/3 of Holland was destroyed. At 9 a.m., a fire broke out in Manistee's 4th Ward. At 2 p.m., the Maggle and Canfield steam mill burst into flames. At 9:30 p.m., fires erupted along Lake Michigan's shoreline. By dawn, Manistee was largely gone. In Port Huron, on Michigan's eastern shore, fires that had been smoldering in the forests suddenly roared to life in the afternoon. The flames swept across Michigan's Thumb region, destroying White Rock, Port Huron, and numerous smaller communities. The fire traveled clear across the state to Lake Huron's shores. Historians have identified 37 separate fire areas that flared up on October 8th, 1871. 37. Not one fire spreading, not 2 fires, coincidentally happening at once. 37 distinct ignition areas across Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan, all on the same day. The total area burned was over 2 million acres. That's more than 3,000 square miles, an area roughly the size of Connecticut and Rhode Island combined. The death toll across all fires ranges from 1,700 to over 2,500. Peshtigo alone killed 1,500 to 2,500. Chicago killed 300. The Michigan fires killed anywhere from 200 to over 500, though the exact number is unknown because many victims were transient loggers and settlers whose presence was never documented. This is the deadliest fire day in American history, by a massive margin, and it's been almost completely forgotten. The official explanation for the simultaneity is a large cyclonic storm system positioned over the eastern plains on October 8th. This created strong southwesterly winds across the Great Lakes region. When these winds hit drought-stricken forests filled with logging debris and existing small fires, catastrophe followed. Multiple fires across a wide region, all triggered by the same weather system hitting the same conditions at the same time. This explanation is taught in forestry schools. It's accepted by fire scientists. It's the consensus view. And it might be correct. But I found another pattern in the fire locations. If you map the 37 fire areas, they form a rough line from southwest to northeast, Chicago to Peshtigo to Michigan's Upper Peninsula, like something entering the atmosphere at an angle and creating a scatter path. In 1883, Ignatius Donnelly, a former congressman from Minnesota who had lived through the fires, published a book called Ragnarok, The Age of Fire and Gravel. He proposed that the fires were caused by fragments from Biela's comet striking Earth. Biela's comet was real, first identified in 1772, confirmed as periodic in 1826, returning every 6.6 years. But in 1852, astronomers observed something unprecedented. The comet had split in two. After 1852, Biela's comet was never seen again as a comet, but meteor showers called the Andromedids appeared each November, following the comet's orbital path. By October 1871, Biela's comet was due for another return. Donnelly theorized it had fragmented further and pieces had entered Earth's atmosphere over the Great Lakes. The theory was dismissed. Donnelly had unconventional ideas about Atlantis and ancient cataclysms. The scientific establishment ignored him. But what if he was right about this one thing? Not that solid meteorites started fires. Meteorites don't start fires. This is established physics. They're cold when they land. But what if it wasn't solid rock? What if Biela's comet had broken up into clouds of frozen methane, acetylene, other combustible gases? What if these gases ignited in the atmosphere or upon contact with existing fires? That would explain the blue flames. That would explain the simultaneous ignition. That would explain the unprecedented heat. That would explain witnesses reporting fire falling from the sky. And it would explain something else. If you wanted to destroy evidence of previous civilization, or cosmic intervention would be the perfect cover story. Natural disaster. Act of God. Nobody's fault. Nothing suspicious. Just terrible timing that all these architecturally significant towns burned on the same night. I found the mass grave in Peshtigo in 2018. It's a cemetery now, entered into the National Register of Historic Places. Over 350 bodies were buried there because there was no one left alive to identify them. The cemetery is well maintained. There's a memorial, a small museum nearby with fire artifacts. What's interesting is what's not in the museum. There's almost nothing about the buildings that burned. A few photographs of the town before the fire, some descriptions of the destruction. But no architectural surveys, no records of building materials, no documentation of construction methods. For a disaster that destroyed an entire town, the surviving documentation is strangely sparse. I requested access to the Wisconsin State Historical Society archives. I wanted to see original records, building permits, construction contracts, anything that would explain how Peshtigo built its infrastructure so quickly after 1859. Most of the records were destroyed in the fire. This is documented. City Hall burned. Records were lost. But what about county records? What about state records? What about newspaper archives from before 1871? They're fragmentary, incomplete, huge gaps. For a town that supposedly boomed in the 1860s, the paper trail is almost non-existent. Holland, Michigan has the same problem. Fire destroyed most pre-1871 records. What survives is scattered. The early building history of the town is based largely on later recollections and reconstructed documents. Chicago's pre-fire records are better preserved because the city was larger and had redundant archives. But even there, huge amounts of documentation about the city's rapid construction in the 1850s and 1860s are missing. It's almost as if someone didn't want detailed records of what these cities looked like before 1871. The comet theory keeps resurfacing. In 1985, Mel Waskin published Mrs. O'Leary's Comet, Cosmic Causes of the Great Chicago Fire. In 2004, Robert Wood, a retired McDonnell Douglas physicist, presented a paper to the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics arguing for cosmic ignition. Both were dismissed by mainstream science. The paper was never formally published, but the theory won't die. Why? Because the eyewitness accounts don't quite match normal fire behavior. Because the geographic distribution pattern is suggestive. Because the simultaneity seems too perfect. And because Biela's comet was real, it did break up, and October 1871 was when fragments should have been near Earth. I can't prove the comet theory is correct. The physics are questionable. There's no direct evidence, no recovered fragments, no observed meteor activity on October 8th, 1871. But I also can't prove it's wrong. What I can prove is this. On October 8th, 1871, fires erupted across the Great Lakes region. 37 fire areas, Over 2 million acres burned. At least 1,700 to 2,500 people died. Buildings with anomalous architecture were destroyed. Records were lost. Evidence was burned. Chicago got the headlines. Chicago got the legend. Chicago is what everyone remembers. Peshtigo, which killed 5 to 8 times as many people, was almost entirely forgotten. Why? The official answer is simple. Chicago was a major city. It had newspapers, it had communication infrastructure. The story was easier to tell. Cow kicks, lanterns, city burns. Simple narrative. Peshtigo was a lumber town in the wilderness. The people who died were immigrants, lumberjacks, farmers, not important people by 1871 standards. Their deaths didn't make national news the way Chicago's did. This explanation is probably correct. But consider the alternative. What if Peshtigo was forgotten because what burned there was too significant? What if the architecture, the construction techniques, the evidence of previous civilization was too obvious? What if Chicago became the story because it was the acceptable story, the controllable story? The story that didn't raise uncomfortable questions about who built these cities and when. I'm not saying there was a deliberate conspiracy to bury Peshtigo. I'm saying the incentive structure was already in place. Chicago was important. Peshtigo was not. Chicago's story fit the narrative. Peshtigo's story raised questions. So Chicago became the fire everyone remembers, and Peshtigo became the fire almost nobody knows about. National Fire Prevention Week was established to commemorate the Chicago fire, not Peshtigo. Not the deadliest fire day in American history, just Chicago. The pattern repeats throughout what we call the reset period. The 1850s through 1870s, cities built with impossible speed. Infrastructure that seems too advanced for frontier settlements, then disasters, then reconstruction with simpler architecture, then the original buildings forgotten. The 1871 fires fit this pattern perfectly. Before 1871, you had ornate civic buildings, elaborate hotels, sophisticated infrastructure in towns that had supposedly been founded just decades earlier. After 1871, you had simplified reconstruction, wood frame buildings, practical architecture, nothing that raised questions about construction methods or timelines. And the pre-fire architecture? Destroyed, documented only in scattered photographs and fragmentary records. This is what bothers me most about October 8th, 1871. Not just that it happened, not just that so many people died, but that the physical evidence of what these cities were before the fires was so thoroughly destroyed, and the destruction was so thoroughly forgotten. You can visit Peshtigo today. There's the cemetery, the museum, the memorial dedicated in 2012, 141 years after the fire. But there's almost nothing about the architecture, almost nothing about what the town actually looked like, almost nothing about the buildings that burned. The official history focuses on the tragedy, the deaths, the heroism of survivors, the lessons about fire safety and forest management. It doesn't focus on what was lost, and maybe that's deliberate. Maybe that's the point. Because if you started examining what burned on October 8th, 1871, you might start asking uncomfortable questions. Questions about construction timelines. Questions about who had the technology to build elaborate civic structures in the frontier wilderness. Questions about why these buildings looked old when they were supposedly new. Questions the official history doesn't want asked. I found one photograph in a private collection. An image of Peshtigo taken in 1869, 2 years before the fire. It shows the main commercial district. The buildings have stone foundations with precision fitting that matches techniques I've seen in photographs of pre-reset European architecture. The metalwork on the balconies shows design patterns that appear in structures dated decades earlier than Peshtigo's official founding. The photograph has never been published in any official history of Peshtigo. It's not in the museum. It's not in the Wisconsin Historical Society archives. It exists in a private collection, held by descendants of a survivor who took the image before the fire. I asked the descendant if I could use the photograph for research. They declined. Family doesn't want attention, they said. The fire was enough tragedy. Maybe that's just privacy. Maybe it's grief still echoing through generations. Or maybe someone told that family not to share what Peshtigo really looked like. Here's what I can tell you with certainty. October 8th, 1871 happened. Fires burned across 3 states. 1,500 to 2,500 people died at Peshtigo alone. This is historical fact. You can verify it in contemporary newspapers, in the Wisconsin Legislative Report of 1873, in the mass grave that still exists. The fires occurred during severe drought. This is documented. The Midwest had experienced one of the driest summers on record. Strong winds occurred on October 8th. This is documented in meteorological records and eyewitness accounts. The fires destroyed buildings. This is documented. Peshtigo, Holland, Manistee, Port Huron, parts of Chicago, all suffered massive structural loss. Biela's comet existed, broke up in 1852, and was due for a return near Earth in late 1871. This is verified astronomical fact. Eyewitnesses reported blue flames, simultaneous ignition, unprecedented heat, and fire appearing to fall from the sky. This is documented in multiple contemporary accounts. Those are facts. Everything else is interpretation. The mainstream explanation attributes the fires to drought, wind, and logging debris. Terrible natural disaster, bad timing, unfortunate coincidence. This explanation is accepted by historians and fire scientists. It requires no unusual phenomena. It's based on known fire behavior under extreme conditions. The alternative interpretation sees patterns, architecture that seems too advanced, records that are too fragmentary, fires that are too simultaneous, temperatures that are too extreme, phenomena that don't quite match normal combustion. This interpretation suggests something else was happening on October 8th, 1871. Maybe cosmic intervention, maybe technological destruction, maybe deliberate burning of evidence. This interpretation is rejected by mainstream science. It's considered conspiracy thinking. It's dismissed as fringe speculation. I can't prove which interpretation is correct. What I can prove is that on October 8th, 1871, evidence was destroyed. Buildings were lost. Records were burned. And the deadliest fire in American history was systematically forgotten while the less deadly Chicago fire became legend. Whether that's coincidence or conspiracy, natural disaster or deliberate destruction, I cannot definitively say. But the pattern is there. The questions are there. The missing evidence is there. And the silence around Peshtigo, the way it's been buried in history while Chicago dominates the narrative, that silence is deafening. 1,500 to 2,500 people died. Most of them reduced to ash so fine it blew away in the wind. Their deaths have been forgotten. The buildings that burned have been forgotten. What was lost on October 8th, 1871 has been forgotten. Maybe that forgetting was natural. Maybe it was just the way history works. Big cities get remembered, small towns get forgotten. Or maybe that forgetting was the whole point. The evidence that burned on October 8th, 1871 is gone. The records are fragmentary. The witnesses are dead. All we have left are questions, and the official story that says we shouldn't ask them.